Thank you, Pat. Let me click two buttons here and bring up the presentation.
Of course, and if you allow me, I just want to, for purposes of recording, give the name of our webinar today. So presenting today's webinar, Managing Compliance During Periods of Significant Supply Chain Disruption, is Victor Gesser, RVCF's Retail Executive Advisor. And now you may take it away, Victor.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be with us today. I'm sure you'd all agree that COVID-19 is a global supply chain disruption unlike anything we've ever felt before. Here at RVCF, we felt we were well positioned to gather insights from trading partners about how they're dealing with compliance management through this, with the goal being that we could help you better understand and collaborate with your trading partners. So we sent out surveys late in the summer to both retailers and suppliers, got a pretty good response back from both groups. The objective of the surveys, as you can see on this slide, were around how we would expect retailers to make decisions, how well these decisions are communicated, both internally and externally, what qualifies as a reason to pause compliance, how trading partner relationships are treated. Are they all treated the same or differently? Is the pause still in place at this late point in the year? Although obviously COVID-19 hasn't gone away. What challenges are the suppliers still facing in the supply chain or with compliance issues from retailers? And then last of all, of course, we always ask for comments, and we get some great insights back from both retailers and suppliers on what trading partners are telling each other. Bear with me for a second. I'm having a problem here. Here we go. So the first question we asked, how many of the retailers that you do business with, this first question was to suppliers, do they have compliance programs? And as you can see on the left side, a few said none. About 25% said a few do. The big answer was 60% saying most of them do, but only about 10% said all of them do. When we asked the retailers the same question, 23 out of the 25 retailers that took the survey said they have compliance programs. So on this first slide, I think it's worth calling out that my suspicion is that of the 58 suppliers that responded back to us, quite a few of them are probably doing business with some retailers that are not in our survey. And my suspicion is that those would be some pure e-commerce retailers where they may not yet have compliance programs up and running. The 23 of the 25 retailers that said they have compliance programs, my recollection was that these were all fairly large national retailers that have both brick and mortar stores, and most of which also have e-commerce operations as well. So then we asked the suppliers, how many of the retailers that have compliance chargeback programs will pause compliance during a major supply chain disruption that's outside of their control? And the suppliers said a few, about 65% of the time, and most or all about another 25% of the time. So it is pretty common to see compliance being paused. And I think the reason we don't see all is fairly broad from the standpoint of what retailers must be taking into consideration when they choose to pause a program. The retailers told us, you know, they'll pause compliance for an affected supplier when supply chain disruptions that are outside of their control occur. So what is a supply chain disruption that's outside of their control? We'll get to in a moment, because there's obviously a pretty wide variance in maybe what a supplier feels and what a retailer always believes should be a legitimate reason to pause. When we asked the suppliers to take a look at a few prior examples of supply chain disruptions, and give us some comparison to what the current pandemic has created, you can see that about 25% said a dock strike might be a good reason that they would get some compliance, temporary compliance relief. Earthquakes at about 20%. Major weather disruptions, I guess hurricanes, tornadoes, that type of thing, about half of the time. And the pandemic, of course, sets a new level for disruption for all trading partners at about a 95% level of likelihood that they got compliance relief. I think when you look at these kind of results, you probably should consider that there's a lot of factors that a retailer probably looks at when they're thinking about, do they pause their compliance? Let me give you a few examples. In my mind, they would be looking at the supply chain flexibility of the supplier or the category in general. They might be looking at safety stock expectations that they have, lead time expectations around PO lead times, what kind of expedited freight opportunities may or may not exist to get away from poor compliance. What their competitors are doing is probably a very valid thing that retailers take into consideration. And they obviously hear that pretty quickly from their supplier trading partners. I think even inventory allocation management and their concerns about allocation management probably play a role in that. So altogether, it's likely that how they determine a pause can vary quite a bit based on the circumstances, the impact, how broad it is, and what they believe the supplier is capable of doing. So when we went to the retailers, and I'll take a little extra time on this one so you can read the whole thing at your own pace, we asked the retailers to tell us whether they would not consider compliance pausing, or to a small degree, to a fair degree, or to a large degree they would, based on different disruptions. And you can see that about 25 retailers answered all these questions. And I'll read the first one just to take you through it. The factory disruption or a factory shutdown. One retailer said, no, that would never be a reason. 11 of them said, yes, to a small degree, we might pause compliance for that supplier if that happened. 9 of them said to a fair degree, we would consider that. And 4 said to a large degree. So I decided that we would take the fair and the large, add those two together and divide them by the total 25. And that's what the 13 you see on the right side of the screen is, to give us a 52% probability that these 25 retailers would pause compliance. So you can see on a factory shutdown, about half of the retailers tell us that that would be likely they would pause. And then as you read down, you can see at the bottom, a pandemic was 88%. There's a number of them that are in the 20s. Probably worth calling out is the one that's only 4%, which is a supplier internal system or software disruption. So if a supplier was changing over their computer software, or their warehouse management system or something like that, the retailer probably wouldn't have a lot of sympathy. And the reality would be that it would probably not be paused. That doesn't mean there aren't exceptions where you can deal with individual chargebacks. I have no doubt that those are discussed and disputed and resolved, hopefully in a good way for both trading partners. But this slide just should give you an idea of what they consider to be an impact of magnitude. Extreme weather event was the third highest at 44%. And then the other ones, as you can see, stuff like a dock strike or a container shortage, not high probability. So we then said to the suppliers, with most retailers, do you have to request a pause, or is it offered by the retailer? About 65% said we have to request a pause. When we asked the retailers the same question, they said about 45% of the time the supplier needs to request a pause, but about 50% of the time, we make that decision without them requesting and communicate it out to them. Our next question went to the retailers. If you paused compliance earlier this spring because of the COVID-19 pandemic, did you pause it only for select suppliers or did you pause it for everyone? 56% of the retailers, or 13 of them, said we paused it only for select suppliers, and about 44%, or 10 of them, said we paused it for everyone. So we said to the retailers, if a supplier must request a pause, how must they do it? 29%, or 7 retailers, said you got to do it through, we have you do it through the merchant. 10 of them, or 41%, through vendor relations. Not applicable, meaning that nobody needs to request the pause, is 4 of them. And other, which was 3, was answered by 3 retailers with, we do it on a case-by-case basis, we do it individually, or we do it through the buyer. I'm not sure why they didn't answer with the merchant on that one. But as you can see, the high probability is it's going to be either the merchandising group, the vendor relations group, that is going to tackle the question from the supplier and give the initial consideration. Suppliers, when retailers pause compliance, do they generally stop compliance for all chargeback failures or just for specific types of failures, such as on time? And their answer came back from the retailers. About 30% says we pause it for all, and about 70% said only for some. I think that makes pretty good sense. My guess is that if your compliance program allows you to pause compliance selectively by type of compliance, you're likely to be pausing it for the delivery speed, the delivery quantity, but you likely still expect to have good quality, an ASN, good communication, labels that are scannable, packaging that's correct, that type of thing. My suspicion is that maybe some of the retailers that say we pause it for everything, maybe that's somewhat system driven, or they're just very generous. So the next question we asked suppliers, when retailers consider a pause in their compliance chargeback program, how would you rate their communication process? And the supplier said about 40% of the time it's fair, and about the same percent, just a little under that, said it's good. A very small percent said that it's excellent. And about 10%, +, 12% there said it's poor. When we asked the retailers, how do you usually communicate a pause? The vast majority, about 60+% said we use email, followed by both a portal and other. And the other included answers like via a compliance system, or we only communicated if they ask. That was a strange answer. And then via the buyer was one of them, which I'm assuming the buyer might either use email or a phone, not sure. But the majority now are email, and there were a good number that said via a portal. I think it brings up a great question here when you look at how the retailers are communicating and how the suppliers are rating fair and poor. I don't know for sure whether their emails, when the retailer uses email and portal, whether it's done quickly so that they get a high rating on that. But I also suspect that it may be who receives at the supplier side the email, or who at the supplier side is responsible to look at the portal, and how well and quickly the individual or team at the supplier side communicates that internally within their organization. That may be an opportunity area for both retailers and suppliers to take a look at. The next question we asked suppliers, has your retail contact been furloughed or non-responsive? And they said only a few retailers are having that problem with them. About 30 of them said only a few. 16 said at many retailers we are having issues with furloughed contacts or non-responsive contacts. That's disappointing, but both trading partners obviously had some pretty dramatic reactions to the pandemic as it struck, and it became clear that people would start shifting to work at home, or retailers would have to lay off folks or furlough folks. So it's not surprising that it wasn't ideal from a communication standpoint. When we went to the retailers and said, were they having trouble contacting their suppliers for the same reasons, 10 of the 25 said no, 11 said only to a small degree, and 3 said to a fair degree, only 1 to a large degree. So I think the takeaway here is that retailers had a little more success getting to someone at the supplier and working with them. Suppliers, as is often the case, because retailers have so many suppliers, often well over 1,000, the suppliers had a harder time getting through and getting responses back. The next question we asked suppliers, do you know who determines when compliance will be paused or when it will be turned back on? They said they thought the merchant made that decision about 15% of the time, the supply chain less than 10% of the time. The clear answer was vendor relations at about half the time made that response back to them about what was going on. On the retailer side, we said, who makes the determination to pause compliance? And they said the majority of the time it's vendor relations at about 35%, but an equal number of times it's other. And as we looked at the other, we found that was an internal collaboration between merchant, supply chain, vendor relations. So you really can put the other into all the boxes. The probability is very high that when retailers make a determination to pause compliance, they discuss that internally first so that all the affected groups know what's about to happen and can make whatever changes or adoptions they can attempt to try to work around the problem. Merchants obviously might be quickly trying to figure out, are there alternative product sources they can go to? The supply chain obviously needs to be well informed. Inventory management needs to make changes. So I think you'll find on the retailer side, it's pretty collaborative and probably became even more so during this pandemic with the magnitude of the impact. All right, so let's look at a couple of comments came back specifically from retailers around this decisioning process. And forgive me for reading to you, but I feel like that's probably the right thing for me to do here. For broad exception requests, the vendor management team meets with the vendor to understand challenges, scope, full impacts, corrective actions, if applicable, and the projected recovery. Supporting documentation is sometimes requested, and it's expected that vendors are being as transparent and as communicative as possible. That's a pretty in-depth way at looking at the issue and trying to collect all the relevant information to make a well-informed decision. We asked for specifics regarding production capabilities and staffing rates to understand what their levels are compared to normal capabilities. We see if adjusting other items such as lead times or adjusting PO line items will help the vendor stay closer to the original forecast plan for delivering product, thus avoiding the need for pausing compliance monitoring. So obviously the retailers in an ideal situation would not want to cause compliance, but would try to create some minor or even major changes to some of their PO requirements in order to stay as close to plan as possible. And I think that's a best practice without a doubt. It's probably better to extend the PO delivery date or alter the order quantity to the vendor's fill capability rather than just turning off compliance and dealing with some of the negatives that come from that activity. Some key suppliers work with divisional merchandise executives and the supply chain vendor compliance executives for temporary suspension of late deductions. Not surprising, you'd expect larger key suppliers to take a very active role in the decision process, want that to be collaborative. And then last of all, vendors are in communication with the merchants regarding the changing conditions within their organization. So clearly, vendor relations supply chains expect the merchants to take a leadership role in supplier management and to be kind of the catalyst behind what needs to happen, for how long, and to what degree. Back to some of the questions. So we said to the suppliers, do you feel most retailers are fair and reasonable regarding when they choose to pause it? A little over 50% said sometimes they are. 30% said they often are. Only a few percent said they always are. Suppliers, we also asked, do you feel retailers are fair and reasonable when they turn it back on, when they choose to turn compliance back on? Again, here the answer no was higher at about 25% than the no was on turning it on. So that's an early indicator of where we're going to go in this survey. We're going to clearly see that suppliers feel it's been turned back on too soon. Sometimes was a little under 50 rather than a little over. Often was about the same at just a tad under 30%. So not way apart here, but a little apart on the issue of turning it back on too quickly. Retailers, do your supplier contracts sometimes include a force majeure clause? And if so, does this factor into your decisions to pause compliance chargebacks during events that are beyond the supplier's ability to control or manage? This may not be on the radar screen of everyone on the call, so I took a second to kind of tell you what a force majeure clause is. It's a French term, means superior force. It's a contract provision that relies on the parties. It relieves the parties from performing certain contractual obligations when certain circumstances beyond their control arise, making performance either inadvisable, commercially impractical, illegal, or impossible. So it's reasonable to assume that a pandemic that shuts down a great deal of the supply chain would trigger a force majeure clause and allow the trading partner with the clause in their contract to ask for relief until conditions return to something more normal. What you see from the retailers is, yes, these clauses do exist in trading partner contracts, and probably in the neighborhood of 40–45% of the time they apply or they exist. No, at about 35% of the time, and of course some retailers don't know the answer to that. Our responses back from vendor relations and supply chain people don't always mean that they have visibility into the legal contracts. And that would also be true on the supplier side. I suspect operations, compliance management may not have full visibility into that as well. So we shifted a little bit in our surveys here from what was general questions about supply chain disruptions. And as I just pointed out, we covered different types of disruptions and asked questions about, in general, what do you do? Now we wanted to ask some very specific questions about the current conditions that are impacting everyone in COVID, in a COVID-19 pandemic. The first question we said, do retailers turn compliance back on for all suppliers at the same time, or do they determine this by supplier? The suppliers felt like they turn it back on for all suppliers at about 27–28% of the time. They determine it by individual supplier about 20% of the time. And the majority of suppliers honestly said, hey, we don't know. We don't have visibility into whether the retailer is treating us the same as they treat everybody else. We can only, maybe go by what they suspect or what they're hearing back from the retailer or from the sales side of their organization. So we asked the retailer this question: have you already turned compliance back on for some of your suppliers? And over 70% of the retailers said, yes, we have, and about 25% said, no, we haven't. And then we said, have you turned it back on for all your suppliers? And here, a little over 50% said, yes, we've turned it back on for all our suppliers now. But remember, that might have been turned back on and still have some accommodations from the normal compliance requirements in things like lead time, fill rates, things like that. But again, here, a little under 50% said, no, we haven't turned it back on yet for all suppliers. So we said to retailers, if you're turning compliance back on, who makes that decision? None of them said it was solely made by the merchant. Supply chain, they said 25% of them said the supply chain makes that call. 37% said vendor relations makes that call. And again, about 37% said other, and other was always again defined as a multiple department collaboration of the above groups, and sometimes included the inventory team as well. So I think that's not too far-fetched, even though some people said supply chain makes the call and vendor relations makes the call. I'm pretty strongly believing from the verbal conversations I've had with retailers and suppliers that behind the scenes, they're talking to each other internally before they're making the call externally. You really don't want to have surprises for any one group inside the company that somebody else has done something that impacts them and they don't know about it in advance. Not ideal. So we said to retailers, how do you or how did you determine when you would turn compliance back on for a supplier? 30% of them said, hey, we look at a specific supplier capability. About 20% said, we make the decision at a category level. We turn categories on based on the category's capability. So that would probably be the majority or the main suppliers within that category. And then the majority of them, 46%, said, hey, it's a company-wide decision. And the other, which was small, was again defined as multi-departmental collaboration. So let's look at some of the supplier comments that came back on the current challenges. While pausing the compliance chargeback program is greatly appreciated, I'd like them to understand that turning compliance chargeback programs back on without communicating substantial changes to needs and forecast trending issues puts both parties in the same position as if the program hadn't been paused, with no mutually acceptable resolution having been achieved. That's a mouthful, and I think it's a very relevant point that I'm sure we all agree is happening, which is when COVID-19 struck, demand and supply changed dramatically. The bullwhip effect affected the rate of sales and then suddenly the rate of demand. And today, probably forecasts are pretty aggressive out there. The capabilities from the suppliers are not as high as the aggressive forecasts, and it's creating a whole nother level, I'm sure, of both frustration and management by merchants and the inventory team to try to get back in line with what they need and expect in inventory. And to this supplier's point, obviously, until that happens, they're feeling strongly that compliance being turned back on is premature. We have a very large retailer that gave forgiveness for a few weeks to all vendors, but turned changes back on in the middle of the pandemic, and the financial charges are coming in again loud and clear. It's disappointing to see the charges when we are communicating daily to them on issues and challenges. I think some chargebacks are profit centers, and these charges really are disappointing. That's not a big surprise from a response. What to a retailer might be an expense recovery area can certainly feel like a profit center to a supplier, and in some cases may very well be somewhat abusive. Hard to say that we can make broad statements in that regard. But again, here the same issue, which is that current conditions are not adequate for a supplier to perform at the level that they're being asked to. And we'll get into more about what those current conditions are. Last one here, retailers viewed the pandemic was over and chargebacks were turned back on. Meanwhile, suppliers needed to implement and maintain social distancing practices that would still impact on-time shipments. Also, the trucking industry and port processing were impacted by the pandemic, and things were not resolved when retailers wanted to turn chargebacks back on. So that's touching on a couple of these external logistical areas that are still underperforming the need that is out in the marketplace. Let's get back to a couple questions. Specifically, we said to suppliers, what are your problems on a phone call? They told us what kind of questions to ask on the survey, and one of their biggest issues was around trucking and the on-time capabilities and capacity capabilities of trucking. Are you still experiencing delays in routing? Sometimes was about 45% of the answers, often was 35%, and almost always almost 10%. It validates that transportation is probably the single largest current supplier problem. That may not be true for all suppliers, but certainly for many of them. So we asked the supplier, if you do continue to experience delays in routing pickups, does this create a late chargeback from the retailer that has to be disputed? No, and rarely, got about 10%, sometimes was 50% of the time, and often and always adds up to well over 20%. So I think most suppliers, now that compliance may be back on from many of their retail partners, are treating this delay in shipping issue as a we have to dispute it. And that's the only way we can potentially negotiate an agreeable outcome. Suppliers, do most retailers offer exceptions from chargebacks for late shipments due to COVID conditions? So basically, to that exact point, no, about 25%. Only a few do this, about 35%. Most do this, a little under 35%, and all do this, a little under 5%. So they're having some success here, but not broadly. Has your retail customer been lenient in negotiating chargebacks? Yes, about 20% of the time. Only a few retailers are lenient was the major answer at about 65%. Many retailers are, and most retailers are, came in at about a total of 15%. We asked the suppliers, have the retailer's ship cancellation or arrival windows been expanded to accommodate the impact of COVID-19? No, from 30%, some 30%, a few and most came in at a total of about 30%. So there's definitely retailers out there that are working closely and making adjustments, which seems like the right thing to do if you're turning compliance back on, at least from what I gather. Retailers, we asked the same question, are you still offering compliance exceptions or making any adjustments to your on-time or fill rate requirements due to current delays in routing and transportation? And here, the vast majority, 75%, said yes, we are, and about 25% said no, we're not. Let's look at a few more general comments from suppliers. The most glaring issue everyone is facing who imports products for retailers is the flow of goods from China to the US is hampered by container availability, as well as, most importantly, extremely slow to get containers off ship and through customs. Many ports are operating below personnel levels due to CV-19 capacity, and there is also a major shortage of trucks available to move freight. Many drivers are not driving now, and a shortage of trucks, so ship windows need to be lengthened by the retailers. Leniency has ended. Many previous and new restrictions continue to be regularly added on at the retailer's end. And while many supply, demand, transportation issues, rising costs for services to meet new restrictions, which I take are probably safety COVID-19 related, inaccessibility of key parties needed to resolve or address issues, back to the communication issue, continues to become a losing fight for vendors. Some issues are understandably unavoidable, but forecast, responsiveness, and communications are all issues that can and should be addressed, both for the retailer and the vendor to enjoy mutually beneficial business relationship. And last of all, partnerships are key when dealing with such a unique worldwide pandemic. We had some great retailers give us waivers and send communications out on their portals with details, but we also had some that would not budge or understand supply chains may come from another country and delays happen when the entire world is dealing with such a unique issue. We love all our retailers and appreciate the business, just wish for more partnership opportunities. That's an excellent sentiment, I think. My hope is that, you know, as we all get through this, we all become better partners and we all get more practice at closer communication and collaboration. That certainly is what RVCF will spend its time focusing on working towards. So last of all, and I'm getting near the end, retail general comments here. These are some of the takeaways that I feel we can glean from the survey responses. They really do handle vendor issues on a vendor by vendor basis. At this time, exemptions are being managed on an exception basis. We're not offering any full exceptions, but instead are reviewing by metric and for a defined time frame. While there are supply chain disruptions, these coupled with increased demand has almost made this a two-pronged approach. Even with good supply chains, the demand is up 100+%. So that plus overseas shipment fabric and other part shortages has exacerbated the issues. So retailers clearly aware of the impact here broadly beyond just the COVID-19, but also what that's done to demand and supply. Global pandemic disruption beyond anyone's control, followed by an unprecedented demand, has driven our decisions regarding disabling, pausing, or exempting certain late deductions across all merch categories. We're still determining how, when, and to what degree to resume compliance chargebacks. So here's a retailer that's still very much in the thick of, we're working to figure out what to do. We haven't made definitive decisions that affect all of our suppliers. We're trying to take it at a slow, one step at a time kind of comment. Here's my observations from all of this. There's no single playbook out there that the retailers are all following for managing compliance. No doubt the suppliers know this. They see a wide range of behaviors from their retail trading partners. Hopefully they're working hard to educate their retail trading partners. We saw a wide range of retailer responses to how they dealt with this, all the way from not turning compliance off at all to having it off and still being off at this point. Many suppliers are still facing significant challenges due to both COVID-19 and to the impact it's had on the supply chain. The recovery now is not just a COVID-19 supply chain recovery, it's also a forecasting and an allocation nightmare for a lot of these trading partners. So that's a whole new set of challenges that they're still trying to work through together. And no matter what you say, there's always opportunities here for closer communication, closer collaboration, and I suspect both retailers and suppliers are going to spend some serious time and energy on their future risk management activities, what they need to do to be better prepared if something of this magnitude happens again, or more likely something of a smaller magnitude that they can get better prepared for. One thing I want to say before I wrap it up is Kim was able to partner with Attain Consulting Group, which is led by Jessica Butler. I think many of you know her. She works very closely with the supplier community inside RVCF. She's a frequent presenter at our conferences. She's the principal of the consulting group. She did a deduction survey back in September on COVID-19 deductions, and her focus was out to suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors, not to retailers. There were some interesting takeaways I wanted to share, 3 in particular. Her survey, as I said, went out to consumer product groups, to apparel footwear groups, and to food and beverage groups. And more retailers in the consumer product category did a better job communicating their compliance plans and their strategies out to their suppliers than did the apparel footwear group or the food and beverage group. 27% positive scores on the consumer product side about what was happening with deduction management, deduction behavior, with apparel footwear and food beverage not performing as highly. So that says something, I think, positive about the consumer product side of retail. The responders to her deduction survey pointed out that one of the biggest challenges they face are longer turnaround times as they face around deductions. And I took this to mean turnaround times in learning about deductions, disputing deductions, getting resolution around deductions are all taking significantly longer. And that, I think, makes sense considering workforces, where they're located and how they're operating and what they're facing going into the fall of this year. Suppliers say the three major concerns that they see going forward is trying to keep up with demand from increases specifically in e-commerce, which I'm sure require different packaging demands on the suppliers, and is obviously the heaviest growth area right now. Increases in shortage claims due to fill rates. So this would speak to the compliance programs still having on-time fill rate or both requirements, and the supplier seeing a lot of claims because they can't fill to the full quantity. And then increases in post-audit deductions. No doubt retailers are taking a hard look at this and trying to figure out whether audits are something they should be doing. So I just wanted to share those. Those did not come out of our survey, but because we partnered with Attain Consulting Group, Kim thought it would be great to look at their survey and glean some insights from it. I think you'll find that her survey is available on the RVCF website. So wrapping this up now, what are we going to do here at RVCF? I think it's critical that we continue to monitor where and how trading partner relationships are being impacted in compliance management because of COVID-19. There is a rapid amount of change and adoption of change going on right now in both retail and with the suppliers. And I think we will look as we move forward at multiple areas, including risk management. What are the opportunities there for both groups? Where are the weak spots in the supply chain, and what are the best practices and opportunities for addressing some of those weak spots? We talked about those just now in the survey. Enhanced demand and inventory visibility. Clearly, this is critical now to retailers in an omni-channel world. And certainly it's critical to suppliers that they can see further upstream in their inventory manufacturing side so that they can make accurate commitments downstream to the retailers. Reducing forecast volatility and PO change frequency probably is important now as ever. Forecast volatility and PO change have always been two of the biggest problem areas for suppliers to deal with, especially right up to the moment of getting ready to ship out orders. And always supplier communication around forecast and PO capability back to the retailer is a tremendous opportunity area. So all of these, I think we continue to focus our conversations every month in our open forums, with our retail and supplier open forum calls, in our surveys, our white papers, and specifically at our conferences. This is where I'll put a lot of my energy coming through the balance of this year and into 2021. So thank you for bearing with me through all that. I hope I didn't go too fast. Pat, I'll turn it back to you. If we've got some questions, I'll do my best to try to answer those.
Thank you, Victor. We do have a few questions for you, and we appreciate your presentation and your insights. I do invite others to continue to submit questions through the drop box in the control panel. But the first one that we have is, which group inside a retailer should be deciding whether and when to pause compliance, and for how long?
Okay, well, this one is probably already mostly answered by my comment in the survey. I think it's critical that it be interdepartmental inside the retailer. And, for the same reason, it should be broadly discussed inside the supplier as well. But at minimum, I would say the supply chain group has to weigh in on what are the realities out in the marketplace on the supply chain, at the ports, through customs, in trucking, whatever the issue might be. The merchants have to weigh in. They obviously have insights to the contract, to what their suppliers are telling them they're capable of, and they're closely partnered to their inventory team. They need very much to be able to make decisions that allow them to have as much flexibility and resourcefulness as possible if they've got to kind of duck and weave around their categories, various suppliers, to try to keep products available to their customers. So, I mean, I think anytime these kind of impacts occur, these kind of disruptions occur, you need to quickly pull the right people together, whether it's just folks in a certain category or broadly across the entire company. You want the management teams from all these areas hearing each other and then making smart decisions about what they'll do in either pausing compliance, or maybe even more likely in simply adding more time or more flexibility to their requirements to allow the supplier to work around the problem. Next question, Pat.
Of course, thank you, Victor. In your discussions, were retailers or suppliers surprised and or impacted by the Walmart updates to their compliance program? It's noted that they did feel some pressure to reassess based on that action.
So I think Walmart updated, from what the trade industry said, on time in full. They kicked it up a notch, which might not have been specific to COVID-19. It might have always been part of a plan that as your supplier community gets better at performing, you keep raising the bar. That certainly makes sense to me, that you don't set the bar at one level, reach it, and then decide you're satisfied for the rest of your life. The ideal situation would be to constantly move the bar, and to move it differently for your different types of suppliers. Some of them might be in industries or have capabilities that their bar is set much higher around on time and full than some of your other categories, where suppliers are either less sophisticated or face much different challenges. Your on time or in full might be very different requirements there. But I do think that these big retailers, when they make large adjustments like that are visible, they do probably impact other retailers and concern other retailers because of allocation decisions that all suppliers must make with the inventory they have. There is a limited amount of inventory, and the supplier probably needs to figure out how they'll allocate it out as it becomes available. We've always believed that the allocation is influenced by many things, including, the quality of the partnership and the loyalty of the trading partners to one another. But let's be honest, it's also probably influenced by financial considerations, and those considerations would include compliance costs. So if Targets and Walmarts and Amazons are all, have high compliance costs, other retailers worry that they may not get allocation until the bigger guys are satisfied in order to manage financial impacts. I think, I can't say for certain, but I think it's certainly a valid concern. And for that reason, you probably did see some retailers turn back on sooner so that they would not be the last one standing when the music stopped, if I can use that analogy.
That makes sense. Thank you. Another question for you. Turning compliance back on too soon sounds like the biggest complaint from many suppliers. Do you think retailers turned back on too soon?
Well, I think the ones that turned it on the way it was before, they paused it. They probably did turn it back on too soon, going by what the suppliers are saying are the realities that exist in the factories still, in the docks, in customs, and in trucking. If indeed all those things are true, and I have no reason not to believe they're true, then my hope would be that if they turn compliance back on, they turned it back on, but they sat down with each of their trading partners and made adjustments to forecasts, PO lead times if necessary, and to the PO quantity, they adjusted to what the suppliers said they could support. Now, if they didn't do any of those things, then the supplier is kind of between a rock and a hard spot, trying to figure out how do I do the impossible, or to what degree can I fulfill? That's a pretty big challenge. So I guess individually, I'm still wearing a mask everywhere I go. COVID-19 hasn't really changed in my world. I got to believe that for many suppliers, it's still a pretty big problem, and the retailers hopefully are finding ways to collaborate with their suppliers so they do get back in stock. But certainly to do that in a way that the two trading partners feel like they'll get through this together and come out stronger.
Thank you, Victor. And I see one more question here for you, but I do want to invite, we do have a few minutes left, so if anybody else wants to submit any additional questions, now's your opportunity. The final question I see is, one supplier comment stated that many new restrictions are being added by retailers to their compliance programs. Are you aware of what these are?
Oh, that's a good question. No, not really. That one was a bit of a surprise to me too, because the supplier's comment said there's been many new compliance demands being placed on them, and I haven't been hearing that elsewhere up to that point. And so it got me thinking that probably my best guess, and that's just a guess now on my part, when you look back over the last couple of years, we've had tremendous growth in e-commerce fulfillment, and we've really seen spectacular growth in direct ship fulfillment, where the supplier takes the order from the retailer and ships it directly out of their warehouse to the consumer, directly to the retailer's consumer. My belief is that those two areas are somewhat outside of the normal supply chain vendor relations compliance management programs at most of the RVCF retailers that we survey. Certainly not all of them, but many of them. And that probably with e-commerce growth and direct ship growth being so impressive right now, the retailers may be adding some compliance requirements in those two areas, not so much to brick and mortar or to the retailer's DC, but rather maybe more around those two areas. And that would be my guess, where their retailers may either be adding that compliance, or they may be moving the management of those areas more into the alignment with the broader vendor relations compliance management of the distribution center order process. And therefore, they're picking up more compliance around everything from maybe labeling and packaging to on time and in full. So that's my best guess. It's something I will ask in the retailer open forum, and Susan will ask in the supplier open forum. And as we learn that, we'll get information back out to our membership around what that is, and we'll try to track that, because we do track compliance pretty closely across a broad number of retailers.
Thank you, Victor. And I see two final questions that have come in, and one of them actually is to me, so I'll answer that one quickly. Will this presentation be available for download? Yes, it will. After this meeting, I am going to create an on-demand video of this webinar, and I will send that out to everyone, along with a link to the presentation deck, so you will have that to be able to view when you wish. And then finally, to you, Victor, where is the best place to start negotiating revisions to forecast and on-time in full lead time for the future as we move through this pandemic?
Well, I'm guessing that's a supplier question, and if so, I would think it would be the sales side of the supplier sitting down or having a phone call, probably in today's world, having a phone call with the merchant to talk about how their performance could be dramatically improved through a collaborative effort to do just that. Without being too lengthy, and I realize this answer does not work for everybody, the best forecast work is in a disciplined process called CPFR, which is an acronym that stands for Collaborative Planning, Forecasting, and Replenishment. And it's a process that's been around for decades, where retailers and suppliers provide resources that weekly look at sales, look at inventory, look at orders, and look at future availability and promotions, and all of those things in an effort to collaborate closely with one another. So if you're really going to make great improvements in forecasting, it needs to be in a collaborative way. It needs to be a partnership where dedicated people at the supplier and at the retailer on their inventory management side are looking at all of the changes that are occurring in sales and inventory and in demand, and making adjustments to constantly keep each other well informed on what's happening and why it's happening, or as best they can, why it's happening, and to come up with solutions. If you can't promote one thing, you promote something else, or you don't promote an item that you can't be sure is going to come in. I think that's where you start. You start with a conversation with the merchant to talk about the desire to do that work and improve it, and you hope that both parties have an interest and have the resources and the bandwidth to do it. That, I got to be honest, that's going to be the problem. Bandwidth is not broad enough in all retailers, and it's certainly not broad enough in all suppliers to dedicate resources to work on that on a weekly basis. So you try to do the next best thing. You try to figure out, are there little parts of that we can do with the bandwidth we have?
Thank you again, Victor, and thank you all for your excellent questions today. We do need to close out today's session, so on behalf of RVCF, we thank you for attending today's webinar. As I said, we will send out a link to the presentation deck and to the on-demand video of this webinar, probably by the end of today. And if you have any future questions about the material covered in today's presentation, please feel free to contact Victor at the email address that you see in front of you on the screen, vingesser@rvcf.com. Thank you all and have a great day.